Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Carl Sims, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with the Council of State Governments. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on improving occupational licensing regulation with sunrise and sunset reviews. Just a couple of notes before we get started. We are recording the webinar, and we'll have that posted to our project website, licensing.csg.org. We'll plan to have that up there in the coming week or so be on the lookout for that, and we'll showcase that URL later in the slideshow as well for you to copy down. Also, we will be taking questions for our presenters today, and you can enter those in the chat box you have on your webinar interface there. However, because we do plan to go for about an hour, we want to make sure we get through our presenters' materials within that span, so we will be holding those until the end for answering by our presenters. So wanted to start off with a little bit about the Council of State Governments. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that serves all three branches of state government. And we do this through a number of ways, including hosting policy convenings, including our national conference. We have regional conferences as well. We'll host a number of policy task forces and academies throughout the year on a particular public policy issue. We also author a number of public policy reports and publications through our outlets, including our magazine, Capital Ideas, our weekly newsletter, The Current State, and then we have an ongoing blog at csg.org, again, about just different public policy topics that are of interest to our members. We also are involved in a number of externally funded work, including occupational licensing, but we also have ongoing projects right now on disability employment and overseas voting, to name a couple. So our work on occupational licensing stems from a grant that we received in 2017 alongside with our partners, the National Conference of State Legislatures and the National Governments Association Center for Best Practices. This was awarded by the Department of Labor to assist states in identifying solutions and best practices on occupational licensure policy. So through this, the partners are currently engaged with 16 states in a learning consortium, whereby the partners are assisting those states in identifying those solutions to best practices, whereby the states have formed teams consisting primarily of those from the legislative and executive branches to discuss different ways to examine their licensure framework in their states and identify those best practices and solutions, with the partners there to provide technical assistance through doing research and then connecting those state teams with peer state groups as well as subject matter experts. So some of the project resources that have come out of this grant can be found on our project website, again, licensing.csg.org, as well as that of the National Conference State Legislatures project website you see listed down there below. So here you can find different policy reports and articles related to occupational licensing policy, such as sunrise and sunset reviews. We also have our webinars posted there, and we also have our occupational licensure database. And I just want to talk a couple minutes about that. We do have that as a comparison of right now over 30 occupations, soon to be expanded to 50, whereby you can cross-examine how the licensure frameworks of states are similar and different across a variety of different metrics, including education requirements, fee structures, training requirements, good moral character clauses, things of that nature. So I advise you to take a look at those resources if you're interested in other topics related to this policy issue. But through this conversation and through our work with the project and those state teams, sunrise and sunset reviews has been brought up consistently as a best practice that states can utilize in order to help be able to analyze their existing regulations and then control the ones that are newly regulated. So sunrise and sunset reviews, as you might know, are neither new or specific to occupational licensing. However, there's that renewed interest because as we see, there is different things that they consider that are related to licensing that can come both at the beginning of that sunrise review before an occupation is regulated, and then as it exists in regulation, a periodic review that states can undergo to examine the continued relevancy for those regulations. So some common characteristics you might see is they'll analyze the presence of legitimate public health and safety concern. You can also include in there the presence of financial harm that can be inherent as well. You can also look at whether the existing protections are sufficient whereas we know that there's a number of regulatory and non-regulatory options available to states to protect the public health and safety. States are increasingly looking at ways to identify the least restrictive measure, and sunrise and sunset reviews can be that formalized process to do that. These reviews can also consider the effect of the licensure on practitioner supply and the price of goods and services, whereas we know as part of that cost-benefit analysis that these reviews can offer, and looking at that trade-off of protecting public health and safety, that it can restrict the practitioner supply and increase the price of goods, so including that into the equation of the analysis. And then also there's a look at the administrative burden that will come with implementing and enforcing licensure. So here is a look at the states that have implemented sunrise and sunset reviews in some kind of capacity. Now states can handle these in a variety of different ways and formats, and again, not all specific to just occupational licensure, but here's a broad level overview of those states that employ those models. So there in the purple, you'll see ones that employ sunset reviews in some kind of manner. You see there in the yellow, Florida being the only state that just has sunrise existing and not sunset, and then the ones in that orange or peach color have both a mix of sunrise and sunset reviews in place. So for sunrise reviews, there are about 12 states that have those existing provisions, and commonly that process can be handled by a legislative committee or an executive agency such as the state auditor. These reviews can be petitioned by the public, so you might commonly see those coming from a professional or occupational group that may be interested in having a regulation in order to, if there's a perceived public health threat. For sunset reviews, there's 36 states that currently have that in place in some kind of format. You can see here the 5 different ways that we've identified how states can employ sunset reviews. So you have the comprehensive approach, whereby statutory agencies are subject to a sunset review once every review cycle, as dependent on what the statute states. About 8 states have a regulatory format, whereby the focus is on regulatory agencies and bureaus. There's a selective process, which 11 states have that, whereby there's a selective implementation and reviews are concentrated on specific entities like licensing. And then some states will employ a discretionary model, whereby a sunset review board, for example, has the ability to select which entities will face review. And then a few states kind of handle a little bit differently, where a sunset clause may be specific to a particular program or legislation. Then on top of this, some states may use a mix of this. So perhaps the state has a regulatory model, but may also have discretionary powers on top of that as well. But here's just kind of that basic overview of how states are divided up in those categories. If you're interested in kind of learning more how each state falls into those categories, there's a couple of different resources out there that you can look at for further information. The Council of State Governments has an annual publication called the Book of States, which is essentially an encyclopedia of state government. And one of those chapters defines those sunset processes and lists state by state how each are handled, and provides some historical context as well. The Council on Licensure, Enforcement, and Regulation also has a webpage dedicated to sunrise and sunset provisions, whereby you can see a table of formats, how each state and then the agency that handles those reviews, as well as links to some of those reports. So I'd recommend checking those out if you're interested in looking at particular states. A couple more notes about sunset reviews. Typically, the review period for an agency or board can range from 4 to 12 years, just depending on how that's laid out in statute. And then sunset reviews can result in not only a recommendation for continuance or termination, but can also come with a renewal with changes recommended, or consolidation of a board or agency. So there's a couple of different ways, or a couple of different results that can come from those sunset reviews. And then again, we're seeing this as a state trend of how states are taking a look at sunrise and sunset reviews as a way to have a best practice for controlling how they license and how they examine their licensure framework. So here's a few examples of states that have recently passed legislation to alter their sunrise and sunset processes. And with us today, we have Senator McCallister to talk about Nebraska's bill, Legislative Bill 299, later in the presentation. But first, we're going to go to our first presenter, Chris Winters from the Vermont Secretary of State's office. talk about Sunrise review model in Vermont. The Vermont Secretary of State's office for more than 20 years. He was hired as a staff attorney for several professional licensing boards. Chris has continued his work under 3 Secretaries of State as the Director of the Office of Professional Regulation, and now as the Deputy Secretary of State. As Deputy, he now oversees the elections, corporations, and state archives divisions, in addition to professional regulation, which remains his favorite subject. So we'll now turn over to Chris for his presentation.
Great, thank you, Carl, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate all the work that CSG does. Vermont has been lucky enough to be one of the member states of the DOL consortium, and so we know that it's really great to get together with other states and share some of their best practices. So I'm happy to be here telling you a little bit about the Vermont model for Sunrise Review, what it's meant to Vermont, and how it's really made a difference for us in professional regulation and the way that we approach it. So hopefully you'll find some things from the presentation today that you can take back to your states and perhaps consider putting a Sunrise review process in place. Carl hit on some of this stuff already. What is a Sunrise review? We like to look at it as a gatekeeper, a process that's used to review and analyze proposed regulation of professions and occupations before that's enacted into law. It's intended in Vermont to help determine the appropriate level of regulation, so not just whether or not something should be regulated, but if so, what's the right-sized regulation to achieve the public protection mission of these statutes. And as Carl said, about a dozen states have Sunrise processes, and the practices will differ from state to state who does that review. In Vermont, it's the Office of Professional Regulation, where I cut my teeth as the staff attorney and then director. That's an umbrella agency in the state of Vermont that oversees the regulation of about 50 different professions and occupations, although there are many others in other agencies across state government. And it'll vary also from state to state what kind of procedure you have, whether it's very specific criteria laid out in your statute or in your procedures, or something much broader to give you a lot of discretion in determining what becomes a regulated profession or occupation. But you will find that most are focused in on public protection and doing a cost-benefit analysis. Next slide, please. So why Sunrise in the first place? All of you are, if you're on this call, you're probably struggling a little bit with the direction that professional and occupational licensing has gone. It seems to have gotten carried away in a number of states, and I'll include Vermont among those. We know it's an economic justice issue, it's a social justice issue, that we right-size our regulation and dial some of that back where it's gone too far. But as you're struggling with that, I think it's first very important for you to consider stopping the bleeding. That you put a gatekeeper in place so that you don't put any new unnecessary regulation in place. So if you have the chance, I would strongly encourage you to think about a Sunrise law that is that check before something new becomes regulated. And so thus the quote from Will Rogers, I'm sure stole this from other people, but if you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you need to do is stop digging. Next slide, please. So in Vermont, we were one of the first states to get a Sunrise law on the books. A lot of them came about in, I think, 1976, 1977. A couple of states were doing this. It was put in the hands of our legislative council. That's the attorneys for our state legislature. And they rarely ever used it. They didn't have the staff, they didn't have the bandwidth, they didn't have the expertise to do the review that was envisioned by the legislature when they put this in place in 1977. So that law sat on the books and didn't do a lot of good at that time. And eventually it came into the Office of Professional Regulation in 1997, where we saw that a lot of new bills were being proposed in front of the legislature. We'd get called in the last second. You'd have proponents of regulation and opponents of regulation fighting it out in front of committees. And we thought there's got to be a better way. We've got this vetting process on the books, but we just need someone to do it. So we offered to do it. We thought it would be best for us to have a seat at the table to hit some of these issues early, to beat the bushes and vet these proposals and have a say in what gets regulated next by our agency. So we don't really have the resources to do it. We only have a couple of staff attorneys in our Office of Professional Regulation, but we thought it was well worth it to invest some of our time in this. And I'll talk a little bit more about the application, report, and recommendation process that we have. In 2015, we took it a little bit further and added even more specific criteria to make sure that the analysis we were doing was focused on public protection and also was a cost-benefit analysis. And we also added a little piece that looks a lot like Sunset that I know Eric is going to talk about in a little bit, which is review of existing regulatory programs to make sure they're having the intended effect that was what was intended when they were first passed. Next slide, please. So here's where we sit in the Institute for Justice's License to Work study. There are a number of different metrics and different places you can look, but generally speaking, Vermont is toward the bottom as far as regulated occupations and professions. And we have, I think, a lot of the reason for that is the Sunrise review process that we've had on the books. Next slide, please. Here's the statute. It's been, as I said, it's been amended a few times, but this section has remained basically the same, that before any profession or occupation is regulated, done for the purpose of protecting the public. So our legislature put this statement on the books that all individuals should be permitted to enter into a profession or occupation unless there's a demonstrated need for the state to protect the interests of the public by restricting entry into the profession or occupation. If that need is identified, the form of regulation adopted by the state shall be the least restrictive form of regulation necessary to protect the public interest. So we're going to be very careful about creating newly regulated professions and occupations, and it's going to be focused on public protection. And if we do determine that there's a need to protect the public, then we right size it and we make it the least restrictive form necessary to stay out of the marketplace, to not interfere in the market with regulation unless it's absolutely necessary to protect the public interest. Next slide, please. So here are some of the criteria that are laid out in statute. You only regulate when the unregulated practice can clearly endanger public health, safety, and welfare. So we tell applicants, we tell stakeholders up front, we are focused on public protection. It's got to be a real harm. It's not a harm that's remote or speculative, because I'm sure you've all heard, if you're in the field of professional regulation, you hear the hypothetical nightmare stories where any profession can be made to sound like there's a real threat out there, when it's actually not the case for a lot of professions that come in front of the legislature for regulation. So it's kind of interesting to go to these people who want to be regulated and say, we're not going to talk about how wonderful a profession you are. We're going to talk about how horrible a profession you are if you really think you need to be regulated. Because if you're wonderful and you're providing great services and no one's getting harmed, there's really not a need to regulate you. So the harm can't be remote or speculative. The public would expect to benefit from the regulation, and that there's no other way that the public could be protected. Now, whether that's by, employment supervision structures or small claims court, or other ways, just the marketplace itself protecting the public. If those things are in place, then you don't need to regulate. So we're looking at all of those different pros and cons of regulation. And then if we do determine that regulation is necessary, then the least restrictive form of regulation should be imposed. So like I said, if there's civil remedies and sanctions, if there's a way to regulate entities or facilities rather than regulate the profession. And then we have our hierarchy of regulation, where it could be something like a simple registration with no qualifications or other requirements, certification, which is a little higher level, and then licensure, which is the most restrictive form of regulation. and we try to do it in that order to achieve the public protection goal with the least amount of regulation necessary. Next slide, please. So in Vermont, we have a sunrise review process and application form on our website. This can be triggered by an applicant, so anyone who wants to propose regulation of their profession, or it can be triggered by the legislative committees of jurisdiction. In Vermont, it's the House and Senate Government Operations Committees. Those applications need to be in by July 1, and then we have half a year to kind of beat the bushes and look for stakeholders, hold public hearings, take public comments, look at other state laws, what kind of harm is occurring in other state laws, what the public benefit of regulation might be. We have a fairly lengthy application with a lot of questions that we ask in order to try to learn everything we can about the profession or occupation before we make our recommendation to the legislature. And we put together that report for January 1st to have on their desks when they come in for the legislative session. The session in Vermont goes from January through May and sometimes June. So we try to get it ready for them on January 1st so they can see our recommendation on whether or not to regulate a profession. We're also looking at other state statutes as we're going through this. We're asking for proposals. So if we do come up with a recommendation for regulation, we would typically propose some statutory language to go along with that. We would recommend whether or not to regulate. We would recommend what that regulation should look like. Should it be just a registration? What should some of the other requirements be? Should there be an exam, an experience requirement, an education requirement? And then we will even recommend where that should reside. So should it be in the Office of Professional Regulation? Should it be in the Department of Public Safety or the Agency of Education? We'll include that in our recommendations as well. Ultimately, it's going to be the legislature's decision. Ours is only a recommendation. Fortunately for us, they've followed our recommendation almost every time with one exception, which is landscape architects, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. Next slide, please. So some of the keys to success in Vermont, and because of this process that we've had, we've been able to stave off, I think, a lot of unnecessary regulation. But it really helps to have a relationship with the legislators and committees of jurisdiction. So we've been talking about this sunrise process for a long time with them. New members get used to it very quickly because we talk about it every year when we're in those committees. When a new proposal comes along, they've come to know that we have this process, and it's a fairly easy way for them to say, oh, you need to go talk to Chris, you need to go talk to the Secretary of State's office about the sunrise review process before you show up in committee asking for a bill. It's a very consistent process. We handle everything the same way. We post a lot of materials up on our website as we're taking the applications and learning more about the profession. And we make recommendations based on input from all stakeholders. They're hopefully evidence-based. They're honest and unbiased conversations that we're having, focused in on public protection. Next slide, please. So many conversations that we've had in Vermont that I've been a part of over the last 20 years in this office. Landscape architects, as I mentioned, we were the last in the nation to regulate. We really couldn't get them to show concrete evidence of harm in the state of Vermont. They went several years up against the sunrise process and kept coming back, and eventually the legislature decided they would disagree with the Office of Professional Regulation on this one finally, and we now regulate landscape architects. But we were able to keep that regulation in check and keep it off the books for a number of years just with our sunrise process, going up against several lobbyists and lobbying attempts that they made every year to get licensed. And it seems like their push for licensure was because Vermont was the last in the nation, that they wanted the recognition, that they wanted the prestige that comes with being licensed. I have nothing against landscape architects. I think they're wonderful people, wonderful professionals, but we didn't see the need to regulate at the time, and now we do. Massage therapists, that's another one that keeps coming back. Probably most of your states regulate massage therapy. We're one of the few states that does not, and we're having the conversation yet again this year with the added twist of human trafficking and voyeurism from a massage therapist in Vermont. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation as you strike that balance between what licensing really can accomplish, staying out of the regulated marketplace versus regulating to protect the public. Another just good example, someone thought it was a great idea to license dog walkers, visited the committee. The committee immediately pointed them to me. I started to explain when we regulate and why we regulate, and that conversation very quickly ended, and they realized that regulating dog walkers was not going to be a good idea. Foresters was a really difficult conversation. In Vermont, we have quite a forest economy, whether it's tourism or logging or paper products. So that was a tough one to determine whether or not to regulate foresters, but this process really helped us vet things, have a lot of meetings outside of the State House before we put a proposal in front of the State House. It was also a very difficult conversation there, but the Sunrise process really let us flesh out what the real issues were, what the sticking points were, and what everybody could agree upon. So the process really helped. If you ever want to take a look at any of our Sunrise reviews and reports, go to the Vermont Secretary of State's website, look for the Office of Professional Regulation section, and we have all of our Sunrise reports up there. And I will say shamelessly that we spend a lot of time on the Colorado Sunrise website because they've done a bunch of reports on professions that we also regulate or have been proposed to be regulated in the state of Vermont. So it never hurts to take a look at what other states work, and Colorado does a really nice job as well on their Sunrise reviews. Next slide, please. So getting toward the end of this here, I think Sunrise could be a very good thing for you or for your state because it is that gatekeeper, and it acts as a brake to slow down so that a real analysis can be done before legislation is perhaps considered quickly and not thoroughly. It's based on facts and evidence, not the emotion that comes or the pride that comes with being a licensee. It's not based on the marketplace and someone trying to carve out a corner of the marketplace and protect it in sort of an antitrust kind of fashion. It's not based on insurance reimbursement, which is another reason we see bunches of professions coming forward trying to get licensed so that they can get insurance reimbursement. That's not what it's about. It's supposed to be about the public interest. It's supposed to be about public protection. And the other thing that I think legislators in Vermont have grown to really appreciate the Sunrise review process because they can defer, they can point their constituents in our direction, they can avoid the fights that happen in committee without proper vetting. That doesn't say the fights won't always happen, but you can, I think, at least temper some of them by getting the issues out in the open before you get to committee. And last but not least, we are focused in on public protection and that mission. So if it's not about public protection, hopefully the legislature isn't going to do it. Next slide, please. That was it. Thank you very much. And I think there's going to be some questions at the end.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, and yeah, as a reminder, if you have questions for Chris or any of our presenters, you can input those in the webinar chat box that you see there listed on the webinar interface, and we'll get towards those at the end of the presentations. But we'll move on to our next speaker, Eric Fajardo from the state of Texas, to talk about sunset process with the Sunset Advisory Commission. So to introduce Eric, Eric Fajardo has worked on the staff of the Texas Legislature's Sunset Advisory Commission since 2007, where he is now a review director, serving in a supervisory role for multiple projects. In addition to supervising the current Sunset review of the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, his projects at the Sunset Commission have covered a wide variety of state agencies, including several occupational licensing agencies like Texas Medical Board, the State Board of Examiners for Speech, Language, Pathology, and Audiology, the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, and the Texas Board of Physical Therapy and Examiners. So I'll turn it over to Eric for his presentation. Eric?
Thank you, Carl. I just want to thank Carl and Council State Governments first for having me on the webinar, and hopefully I can meet my 15-minute cap to get through all of this. All right, so I'll be going through the Texas model and the Texas approach to sunset. I think probably most of our attendees know by now that sunset is just it's a government term, another way of saying expiration. And in Texas, the Texas Sunset Act was passed in 1977. That's a year after Colorado passed their Sunset Act, making us the second state. And as you saw in previous slides from CSG, that more than 30 states followed suit in the years afterwards. And 1977 was the 70s in general were an interesting time, and the passage of the Sunset Act in Texas was largely a response to, well, in part a response to scandals that occurred at the federal and state level. Of course, this is not too long after the Watergate scandal, but and the resignation of Nixon, but also at the state level here in Texas, the Sharp Sound scandal. And so that was part of the impetus behind the passage of the Sunset Act, but also some concern being expressed around this time over unchecked growth in government, particularly in the area of occupational licensing. And as Carl mentioned earlier, that, you know, sunrise, sunset is not a new concept, and I think it's probably a reference to this time. It's just that there's been a resurgence or a renewed interest in this. So for Texas, the sunset has to answer a basic question of whether an agency's functions, an agency or its functions continue to be needed, and if so, what improvements can be made to that agency. But beyond this fundamental question, the sunset's always been more than just shrinking the size of the government. The process also creates a unique opportunity and a powerful incentive for the legislature and stakeholders to look comprehensively at each agency and to make improvements to an agency's mission and its operations. And next slide, please. Okay, so agencies under review. There currently are about 130 agencies that are subject to sunset. That's most executive branch agencies are subject to the full sunset review and abolishment under the Act. Some entities like universities and courts are exempt. Some agencies are subject to sunset review, but not actual abolishment. So they undergo review, but they can't be actually sunsetted. And then sometimes the legislature directs certain special purpose reviews. For example, river authorities, there have also been transit authorities that have undergone sunset, port authorities, etc. The legislature sets the sunset review schedule, and it's usually about every 12 years for each agency. And I should specify, since this is kind of a contrast to Chris in his agency and Vermont's process, that this is a legislative process, and the Sunset Commission is a legislative body and a legislative agency. And in Texas, the legislature meets once every 2 years for a period of 140 days. So we're doing the bulk of our work during that interim period. And for each biennium, there are typically about 20 to 30 agencies undergoing review. And like I said, the legislature sets the schedule and law. It's usually every 12 years for every agency, but the legislature, of course, can change an agency sunset date to allow for more or less time between reviews. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put the current sunset review schedule. These are the agencies that are currently under review. As you can see, it's kind of a wide variety here. You have everything from the Department of Agriculture to the Credit Union Department. You have a couple of river authorities under sunset. And we also, as you can see, have the Department of Licensing and Regulation, which is actually probably the closest thing to Vermont's OPR. This agency is actually responsible for administering 39 occupational licensing agencies. So the Sunset Commission is going to be taking a close look at a lot of occupational licensing this session. Next slide, please. Okay, so who is Sunset? The Sunset Commission is a 12-member commission. The Lieutenant Governor appoints 6 members, five senators and 1 public member, and the Speaker of the House appoints 6 members as well. That's 5 members of the House of Representatives and also another public member. As you can see, the legislators serve 4-year staggered terms, and the public members serve 2-year terms. and the chair and vice chair rotates between the Senate and House every biennium. And we are a staff of about 30 that conduct the independent reviews for the commission. Next slide, please. So in Texas, the sunset process essentially works in 3 phases, beginning with the staff phase, the sunset staff phase. It's initiated by each agency. The summer after a session has concluded, the agencies that are undergoing sunset review in the upcoming biennium are required to submit what we call a self-evaluation report, where they essentially list and describe every statute, every rule, state and federal, to which they're subject or over which they have jurisdiction. They describe their programs. They describe all of their budgetary information, their contracting. All of those things are provided to us, and that's essentially what initiates the review cycle. We typically start meeting with the agency in September of the odd-numbered years. So during the staff review process in phase 1, we are meeting with the agency, we're meeting with stakeholders, we're collecting tons and tons of data, and we're looking to identify problems primarily based on risk. And this culminates with us issuing a report for each agency under review, which we publish on our website. And about a month after publication, the Sunset Commission, the 12-member panel, meets to have a public hearing to hear that report. And these reports are generally released in batches, so there could be anywhere from 4 to 7 or 8 reports being issued at a time, and a hearing will encompass these reports. And that begins phase 2, the commission phase of the process. At the public hearing, the commission will take testimony from us. We'll publicly present, we as staff will publicly present our findings and recommendations, and the agencies will be afforded the opportunity to provide their official response. And then they open up the rest of the meeting to public testimony, and anybody who has an opinion on the report or what they feel should have been included or addressed in the report has the opportunity to provide that testimony. And typically about a month after that public hearing, the Sunset Commission will reconvene to consider the recommendations offered and to take votes on those recommendations. And they can reject staff recommendations, they can accept them or adopt them, and they can also modify them. And the Commission can also, of course, offer their own ideas for recommendations. And what they vote on serves as the final report, which in turn serves as essentially the blueprint for the sunset legislation that will be filed during the legislative session. And that begins phase 3, which is the legislative session. As I mentioned, each report for each agency is filed as a sunset bill for that agency, unless, of course, the recommendation is to abolish, in which case a bill is not needed. And those sunset bills have to pass through the process just like any other bill, any of the 7,000 bills that are filed every 2 years during the Texas legislative process. Next slide, please. So here's a slide on the standards for review. Essentially, 18 criteria drive the sunset analysis, and I included here the 4 criteria that are specific to occupational licensing agencies. And you can see there's some familiar language. You'll see whether the occupational licensing program serves a meaningful public interest, provides the least restrictive form of regulation. I think Chris covered a similar concept in his presentation. Whether the program's objectives can be achieved through market forces, whether the program's requirements are consistent with public interest, or do they merely serve as impediments to applicants or entrants into an occupation. And then also, what is the impact of the regulation on competition and consumer choice and cost of services? The Sunset Commission also has adopted what we call across-the-board recommendations, or ATBs for short. And these are statutory requirements for every state agency that undergoes sunset. and they are designed to ensure open, responsive, and effective government, and the legislature routinely applies these. Some examples are, public membership on policy bodies, prohibitions on conflicts of interest, requirements that board members be trained, requirements regarding the type of information on complaints and their resolution that agencies should be providing to the folks that they regulate and also to the public. And then we have standards in our licensing and regulatory model, which I will get into in the next slide. But before that, another component to standards for review is industry-specific practices. Some agencies face unique circumstances that require us to do research into that particular industry or occupation. Probably the best example and the most recent example is when we were reviewing agencies that license and regulate individuals who prescribe and fill prescriptions for opioids. So that's the State Pharmacy Board, the Texas Medical Board, and whether they were well positioned to perform regulation of individuals that had that authority in order to protect the public interest. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just want to talk really briefly about the licensing and regulation model, which you can find on our website. I actually put the link on that last bullet there. So this is a set of standards for evaluating licensing agencies, occupational licensing agencies primarily, and it's designed to ensure efficiency, administrative flexibility, fairness. But as you can see, we categorize the 73 standards across 6 categories, and the first one is need for regulation. And so we'll do a deep dive for occupational licensing programs to one, determine whether there's a need for the program in the first place. And then beyond that, then we look at their structure, the policy-making body, how they're administered, their licensing practices, and their enforcement practices as well. And what serves as a basis for this model is obviously state and federal statutes and administrative rules, state and federal case law, Texas Attorney General opinions, the work of Benjamin Schimberg, who produced a couple of books in the 80s and 90s on occupational licensing and the type of things that states should be looking for when determining whether an occupation should be licensed. A 2015 White House study that came out of the Obama administration that kind of provides guidance on how to evaluate whether occupational certain occupations should be licensed and regulated. And then, of course, Sunset's 40 years of experience doing this type of work. And I included a bullet here that says that we analyze the standards in the context of each agency. We don't just apply a standard just for the sake of standardization. An agency could deviate from a standard and have a perfectly justified reason for doing that. But we have to conduct that analysis, and we apply standards as appropriate. And like I said, just if anybody's interested in checking that model out, it's on our website, and I provided the link there. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. This is just some statistics on the impact of Sunset since 1977. 41 agencies and programs have been abolished. 51 agency programs transferred, consolidated. About $1 billion in state and federal savings and revenue gains. You can see we conducted more than 550 reviews, and I wish we had Vermont's OPR's track record of only having one disagreement ever with us. Ours is about 80% since 2001, since we started tracking. But as it says there on the slide, we've achieved some major reforms in virtually every area of government in Texas through the Sunset process. And that's it.
All right, thank you, Eric. We'll move on to our next presenter. We have Senator McCallister with us from Nebraska. He's going to talk about occupational licensing reform in Nebraska in relation to that bill that I brought up earlier, Legislative Bill 299, implementing Sunset Review, but also just kind of giving more context to how this relates to the larger conversation of occupational licensing policy reform. So, Senator McCallister, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carl, and thanks to CSG for this effort at licensing reform. It's a very good thing for all states to do. I first became interested in licensing reform when I was at the Platt Institute, which is a free market think tank. And of course, economic issues and the restraint of trade issues is something that I was very concerned of there, and my interest continued when I became a state senator in 2015. First, a couple comments about the other presentations. Both Vermont and Texas have been at this work for a great deal longer than Nebraska has. Our new law just became effective and active in 2019. So we're really new to the game, whereas they've been working at it for a number of years. We really don't have any sunset laws per se. So our approach is a little bit different than some of the other states. Of course, the whole thing started in 2015 with the North Carolina State Board of Dental Examiners, and that established a scope of immunity from the U.S. trust law, and that provision gave immunity only when those people involved in that particular organization are supervised by the state. And of course, North Carolina lost that case. And since that time, states have become very interested in licensing reform, which is good. Next slide. The next few slides have to do with economic policies and statistics. And you'll see that a paper that I used from the Platt Institute, written a couple years ago, cites statistics to show that various states grow at different rates simply because of licensing policies. That may not, of course, be the only reason states grow or not grow, but it is certainly one factor. Next slide. I love this term, deadweight loss, and that relates to lost gains from trade because of the market inefficiencies that prevent some trades. And of course, with employment, it relates to persons prevented by licensure issues from participating in labor markets. And that, I think, is relevant in all states, not just Nebraska. Next slide. Big statistic, 25% larger economy if we had licensing reform throughout the entire country. And that's a big number, perhaps too big, but $13,000 per person shows the magnitude of licensing reform. Next slide. Nebraska, perhaps is like many states, contains over 100,000 regulatory restrictions, or 7.5 million words long. It takes 10 weeks to read. We really recognize that Nebraska has a long way to go. And as I mentioned earlier, we started that. The law became effective in 2019. Next slide. Estimate cost for the state regulations in Nebraska, $473 million. And that would make the economy of Nebraska approximately 25% larger. You know, that's a big number to be sure. Next slide. Nebraska, even so, ranks pretty well in terms of, licensing issues. Nebraska ranked second in the nation according to Cato. According to Pacific Research, Nebraska ranked 44, with 50 being the optimal number. So I think we're doing a good job, but we certainly can do better. And a bill that we passed, LB 299, attempts that effort. Next. So we did sign a bill in 2018, and I should mention that Senator Laura Epke, who's on the call, was the prime sponsor of the bill. I co-sponsored, but she, as chair of the Judiciary Committee, made that bill happen. Called the Occupational Board and Reform Act, a landmark occupational reform act in Nebraska. And in terms of the purposes of the bill, protects the right to pursue a lawful occupation adopting the standard of least restrictive regulation necessary, and periodic review of occupational licensing. And I've heard that those themes occur with the first two presenters as well. Next slide. So the law was passed in 2017, became effective, as I mentioned, January 1st of 19. You can see some of the goals of that bill, essential to the health, safety, and welfare of Nebraskans, process to measure its effectiveness, least restrictive alternative, we've heard that before this afternoon, and state regulatory requirement or federal mandate if some professions have that basis. Next slide. Just some comments that I put together. It was an ambitious undertaking because it's up to the legislature to review 20% of the licenses under their purview every year. It can occur by statute or through cooperation with the executive branch, and it can happen administratively. We've had good cooperation from the executive branch to get that done, and just like some of the other presentations, we've had some conflicts with some of the professions that think their professions should be regulated tightly. And whether or not we're going to be successful, I don't know. We just started the process January 1st, so until the reports are finalized early next year, I don't think we'll know. Last slide. Some issues that I think we need to continue to address in Nebraska: good moral character provisions. Those need to be better defined, and if they don't have any particular relevance to that profession, we need to get those eliminated from some of the requirements. What constitutes a true safety issue for consumers? And then, of course, legal issues, or what misdemeanors or felonies should disqualify an applicant for a license. We need to do a better job of that in Nebraska, and I presume all the other states do as well. We don't need to make our licenses overly burdensome. And if we can recognize a license from a different state that has similar requirements, I think we need to adopt that, or better yet, adopt a multi-state license compact that would improve the portability of licenses. So with that, that concludes my topic.
Well, thank you, Senator McCallister. Here is the contact info for our presenters as well as myself. If you have the questions inside of this webinar and need to get in contact with us, you can do so by email. But we'll go ahead and get to some of these questions that we've received in the webinar chat box, and I will feed these to our presenters for them to answer in the time we have allotted. So give me a moment to bring these up. Okay, so the first question we have will be for Eric, and that question is: does Texas's sunset provision result in a overall feeling that the rules in the state won't remain consistent over the long term, and that there might be a concern by businesses locating to Texas? So Eric will unmute you here for you to answer the question. So. All right, go ahead, Eric.
Okay, so I'm going to need a restating of the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I'll read it again. The question was: does Texas's sunset provision result in an overall feeling that rules in the state won't remain consistent over the long term? And if so, does that seem to deter businesses from moving there?
No, on the rulemaking side, no. I think as it relates to occupational licensing, and I don't know if the questioner is restricting it to occupational licensing. No, I think these are periodic reviews that typically occur every 12 years. So there is consistency in that sense. I mean, there's far more variation in rules and rulemaking coming from the executive branch bodies that are doing the rule changes rather than the sunset process. I think usually it's major reforms and long-lasting reforms that occur through the sunset process. It's not some kind of whimsical thing that changes frequently. You're far more subject to frequent changes through just the regular rulemaking process like the executive branch reforms.
Okay, thank you, Eric. We had a couple questions for maybe some attendees who joined later about if the presentation will be made available for viewing. Yes, we are recording the webinar and have plans to upload that to our project website, licensing.csg.org. We'll try to do that within the next week or so. But move on to a question we have here for Chris. Chris, we had a attendee asking, how much does Vermont spend on their sunrise reviews every year?
That's a great question. I think, as I mentioned, we have 2 staff attorneys in our Office of Professional Regulation, so we don't really have the resources to spend, but we do. We dedicate, I would say, at least 1 or 2 sunrise reviews that we do a year. So, you know, it's easily 100 hours of attorney time. Plus administrator time. We did the calculation once, I don't know, 10 years or so ago. And it's definitely in the, several thousands of dollars, if not $20,000 to $30,000, I think, to do a thorough sunrise review, given all the staff attorney time, all the administrator time, how much effort we all put into doing a good sunrise. So it's not an inexpensive process, but I would say in the long run, it's absolutely worth it and a heck of a lot less expensive than some unnecessary regulation that you get handed on July 1 and have to figure out what to do with.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Then I have a question for Senator McCallister. Senator McCallister, how does your state address executive orders that prohibit the promulgation of rules even when the General Assembly passes a statute to enact a new regulation? Side comment saying Indiana has this in place.
As I mentioned, the executive branch in Nebraska and the legislative branch have very similar views on licensure. So executive orders, I think unless the legislature had deep feelings against that order, we could certainly enact legislation to countermand that order, which would no doubt be vetoed. Did I get the gist of the question? I wasn't quite sure I could hear it properly.
Yeah, I'll just restate it just in case you had anything more to add from that. Just asking how does the state address executive orders that prohibit the promulgation of rules even when the General Assembly passes a statute to enact a new regulation?
Really haven't had that issue come up, particularly with the new law just passed a year or 2 ago. But the occasion hasn't arisen.
Okay, thank you, Senator. The next question that we have, this can be for any of our participants, maybe more so for Chris, because I think more to do with sunrise. But have any states used a sunrise process to get property management regulated in their state? I'm not aware of that, but I wondered if any of our speakers had any comment on that.
Not in Vermont.
Not in Nebraska.
Not that I'm aware of in Texas.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think that's all the questions that we had, but again, if there's anything else that comes up as a question for you or wanting to know more about some of the material that you've heard in this presentation, again, you have our contact information, and we will upload this to our project website. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar, and a special thanks to our presenters for being here today to share the information coming out of their state on sunrise and sunset reviews and the ongoing conversation about occupational licensing policies. So thank you again, and we hope to connect with you soon with future opportunities such as these.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you all.